As you enter the living room, and if you look to the right of the fireplace, you'll see several pictures of Mrs. Aldrich from various stages of her life. She was the youngest of 8 children and was born in Cedar Falls, Iowa. She taught for 5 years and then decided to work on an advanced degree in Marshalltown, Iowa, to go to the University of Northern Iowa. And she moved into a boarding house called the Robin's Nest. While she was um, there was a young man by the name of Captain Charles Aldrich who moved into the boarding house as well to work on his father's estate. Mrs. Aldrich was asked one time if Mr. Aldrich and another gentleman could join her for lunch. As it was customary for them to eat in separate rooms at that time, Mrs. Aldrich nudged her friend Lola and said, "Look, Lola, there's one for each of us." And the two men were allowed to join them for lunch. And in the end, those two ladies married those two men. Mrs. Aldrich and Mr. Aldrich were married in 1907. Mr. Aldrich, who had lived in the house while he was settling his father's estate, was an attorney. He was also a captain in the Spanish American War. He befriends Mrs. Aldrich's brother in law by the name of John Cobbs. Mr. Cobbs and Mr. Aldrich decided they wanted to own a bank somewhere in the Midwest. And that's what brings them to Elmwood, Nebraska in 1909 as they purchased the American Exchange Bank at that time. Now, Mr. Aldrich and Mr. Cobbs came earlier, 2 months earlier to Elmwood than Mrs. Aldrich because she had a new baby. Mary was 2 months old, and before she thought it was a safe time for which she could travel. So then they arrived on a train and lived in Elmwood in 5 different homes. If you look to the window, you'll notice to the left of the windows the pictures of the bankers. We have on the second row Mr. Cobbs, Mr. Aldrich, Guy Clements, who ultimately he and his wife Marie purchased the house. Dwight and Marge Clements then lived here the next generation. And then, of course, we have the current president of the bank, which is Richard. Above them, we have pictures of the children. We have Mary, who ultimately becomes a teacher, taught for a year, and then marries a grocer in Lincoln, Nebraska. Her brother to her right is James. James becomes an illustrator and did several of the covers of Mrs. Aldrich's books and lived in New York City. Then we have Charles, who was an aeronautical engineer, helped work on some landing gear for planes. And finally, Robert, who was a writer of sorts in that he was more of a journalist, wrote for syndicated press, lived in DC at one time and also in California. All the children would have graduated from Elmwood High School, probably a class of 15 to 20 students at the time. Really, it was quite amazing that they accomplished what they did, because we mentioned that this house was built in 1922. A short 3 years later, after teaching a Sunday school lesson at the Methodist Church, Captain Aldrich collapsed in church and died. They had called Mrs. Aldrich to come, that he had taken ill. And when the minister arrived in the car to pick her up, she knew things were not good because he should have been in the pulpit. When he did die, her biography comment was that she guessed her hobby was going to have to make a living. And in fact, we think that might be why she wrote so many short stories and books. She had quite a regiment. She made sure that she wrote a short story once a month, and she sold everything she wrote. But one story took her 29 attempts. The Man Who Caught the Weather was ultimately purchased by Century Magazine, and then once they purchased it, it became one of the O. Henry Award winners for the year. In the room, you'll see 2 small chairs that were Mrs. Aldrich's. And of course, you don't want to ignore the elephant in the room. We have a 1870 square grand piano in here that has an Elmwood history as well, having been owned at one time by Doris Clapp, a good friend of Mrs. Aldrich, who sang at her funeral and her daughter's wedding and her husband's funeral as well. In the room, you will also find, if not this room, in the dining room, a small table with chairs. and it represents the table where Mrs. Aldrich would sit when she would go to get her mail. She would walk to Green's Pharmacy, and while she was there, have a cup of coffee and open her mail. And so ultimately that was donated to the house because of the fact that Mrs. Aldrich would sit at that table and chairs.